The will said I was beloved, but the last line, "She is to receive nothing further," wasn't written in his hand. I knew it the instant I saw it, the same way you know when a note in a song is off key, even if the melody keeps playing. The letters pressed too hard into the paper, as if someone had tried too eagerly to convince the world of their truth. I held the page for a long time, letting my eyes blur until the ink ran into the fibers like something bleeding. I am Eleanor, 81 this past spring, though people like to tell me I don't look it, as if that were consolation for outliving everything that once defined me. 6 months have passed since Robert's funeral, though time at this age no longer moves forward or back. It just settles, heavy and still, like dust on polished wood. The house sits by the sea, a small gray cottage with uneven floors and a garden that insists on living no matter how much salt the wind throws at it. I thought I was learning how to be alone again, to make peace with quiet breakfasts and the sound of waves instead of another person's breathing. But grief, I've learned, doesn't stay tidy. It leaks into drawers, old coats, and books you thought were safe from meaning. That morning had been ordinary in the way dangerous days always are. I was sorting Robert's things slowly, one shelf at a time, not because I was sentimental, but because haste feels disrespectful to what once breathed. When I reached the wardrobe, I found his old Bible wrapped in a silk scarf, exactly where he had kept it during his illness. The scarf was faintly perfumed with cedar and medicine. I hesitated before unwrapping it, because certain objects hum with memory before you even touch them. Inside the front cover, pressed flat like a keepsake, was an envelope labeled in his familiar hand. To be read after my passing. The words made my stomach tighten. He had not been a man of secrets, not in the dramatic sense, but he liked order, closure, the right documents in the right drawers. The will should have been with the lawyer. I had seen him seal the final copy 2 years before the stroke. Yet here was another version, hidden between the Psalms and Proverbs, as if God were asked to witness something private. I sat. At first, it was everything I expected. The formal tone, the deliberate kindness, the acknowledgement of our 52 years together, the instruction that certain books and keepsakes go to our nieces. Then came the paragraph about the property, the cottage, the savings, the pension funds. And there it was, that final line like a blade slipped under a closed door. She is to receive nothing further. I read it twice, then a third time, willing the words to rearrange themselves into sense. The ink of that sentence was darker, newer, the curve of the S wrong. My heart didn't race. It withdrew, folding in on itself like a frightened animal. For a long while I sat still, the page trembling only when my breath caught. Outside, gulls shrieked and the kettle began to whistle in the kitchen, but I couldn't move. The Bible on my lap felt heavier than it had any right to be, as if it contained not scripture, but accusation. When I finally rose, I placed the pages back inside and closed the cover gently, the way you might close a casket you're not ready to seal. I made tea because that is what women of my generation do when faced with unanswerable questions. We put the water on and let the boiling stand in for screaming. I carried the cup to the window and looked at the sea. The tide was coming in, slow and certain, erasing every footprint along the sand. Robert had always loved that image. Renewal, he called it. I used to think it meant forgiveness. Now it looked like obliteration. I tried to recall the days after his stroke, how Mark, his son from his first marriage, had taken over the practical matters. Mark had always been efficient, politely distant, a man who used gratitude like a credit he could cash later. He was executor of the estate, had arranged the funeral, spoken to the lawyer, signed the papers. I had been grateful then. Grief fogs the mind, and I had let him handle what felt too heavy. Now, staring at that altered sentence, gratitude curdled into suspicion. The house, my house, still smelled faintly of antiseptic and ocean air. On Robert's nightstand sat his glasses, folded neatly as if waiting for him. Next to them, his watch had stopped at 11:42, the hour the nurse called me. I reached for it, wound it once, and listened to the click of gears returning to motion. Something in that small resurrection steadied me. I placed the watch beside the Bible. If someone had rewritten his will, they had not rewritten his time. As afternoon light spilled across the floorboards, memories drifted in. Our first apartment, the nights grading papers together, the argument we had when he bought the cottage without asking. He'd said, "You'll thank me one day, Ellie. This is where we'll grow old." He'd been right, but he hadn't lived long enough to see what growing old truly meant, that even love left unguarded can be edited by other hands. I wanted to dismiss it as a clerical mix-up, a misplaced draft. But the longer I looked, the more deliberate it seemed. The pen strokes trembled in a way Roberts never had. The phrasing, "receive nothing further," sounded cold, legalistic, not like him at all. He would have written, "She has all she needs." That was his kind of tenderness, modest but complete. Someone had imitated his affection and turned it into exclusion. I made another cup of tea and sat at the table, tracing the edge of the envelope with my finger. In the silence, I could hear the sea hitting the rocks below the cliff, steady as breathing. A life together reduced to clauses and signatures. I tried to imagine Robert sitting here, pen in hand, deciding how to leave the world behind. He had been meticulous even in illness, checking the garden accounts, apologizing to nurses for troubling them. He would never have written those final words, and yet they were there, stamped with his name. Dusk settled over the room. I lit the lamp, though I could barely read in the dim glow, and laid the will beside my tea. On the wall hung the photograph from our 50th anniversary. Robert in his navy suit, me in a blue dress, both of us smiling as if time had promised to wait. I studied his eyes, calm, kind, weary, and wondered how much of a man's life can be stolen after he's gone. Later, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. The careful posture, the polite composure, all armor now. I thought of calling the lawyer, of demanding explanations, but some instinct told me to wait. When people rewrite truth, they expect outrage. Silence unsettles them more. That night, I placed the Bible on the nightstand beside the ticking watch and lay down. The sea murmured through the cracked window, the same rhythm that had lulled us for decades. Sleep came fitfully, broken by images of ink and erasure, of Robert's hand guiding mine across crossword puzzles, of a pen lifted mid-sentence. At some point before dawn, I sat up, heart steady, and knew this was not grief speaking. It was recognition. Someone had taken his final word and turned it into my erasure. Morning would come, as it always does, pale and indecently cheerful. I would make coffee, feed the gulls that linger near the porch, and then I would begin to look for what was missing. Not the money, not the property, but the truth that had been scratched out between the lines. The will said I was beloved, and I believe that part. The rest, I will make them prove. The next morning, the sky had that pale, indifferent color that belongs to early autumn on the coast, when everything seems to exist just a little out of reach. I woke before dawn and sat in the kitchen waiting for the kettle to boil, not because I wanted tea, but because the ritual of sound and steam makes a person believe the world still follows rules. The Bible lay on the table where I had left it, the envelope now tucked between its pages like a wound I could not stop touching. I kept staring at it as if it might move on its own. Every few minutes I reached out, opened it again, and reread the final paragraph, half hoping the words would rearrange themselves into the truth I remembered. They did not. The more I looked, the more foreign they became, like an infection spreading through familiar flesh. When the light finally reached the windows, I dressed and walked to the study where Robert had kept his files. The drawers smelled of dust and cedar, of the long discipline of an orderly mind. I found the copy of the official will, the one signed and witnessed 3 years ago, and placed it side by side with the version from the Bible. The difference was subtle but undeniable, the same way an imitation pearl glows just a little too evenly. The original ended with warmth. She shall remain in the home for the rest of her natural life, and the contents thereof shall be hers to keep and manage as she sees fit. The altered one was colder, legalistic, detached. She is to receive nothing further. That one sentence turned a lifetime of partnership into a transaction closed. I wanted to believe it was a clerical mishap, a copy gone astray, perhaps an assistant at the lawyer's office making an error. But as I compared the two signatures under the lamp, I saw what I already knew. The one from the Bible was not Robert's. His R always had a flourish, a small loop at the tail, confident but not proud. Here, the line ended abruptly, uncertain, a practiced imitation lacking rhythm. Someone had forged the final act of his life. I sat back in the chair and listened to the old clock in the hallway strike 7. The sound was both comforting and accusatory. How many mornings had that clock watched us drink coffee, read the paper, argue about trivial things like grocery lists and weather forecasts? I had lived long enough to know that betrayal rarely comes with thunder or shouting. It arrives quietly, with the same steady rhythm as that clock, marking time while everything underneath it shifts. I decided to call the lawyer's office. The receptionist answered, a young woman with a voice as bright as morning. When I gave my name, there was a pause. "Oh, Mrs. Green," she said quickly, "I thought the estate was already settled." I told her I had found another version of the will, possibly an earlier draft, and wanted to clarify which copy was valid. Another pause. Then she said, "Mr. Lake is out of the office until next week, but I can make a note." Her tone changed subtly, cautious now, like someone aware of a secret she should not touch. I thanked her and hung up. My hands trembled only slightly. Later that afternoon, Mark called. He rarely phoned unless something needed fixing. "Just checking in," he said too casually. "You doing all right out there?" I told him I was fine and mentioned the will as if in passing. There was a silence so complete I could hear the static hum of the line. "What will?" he asked. I explained about the copy in the Bible. "Ah," he said finally. "Dad probably just drafted something for reference. You know how he liked to have backups." His voice was too smooth, the words landing a half-second too quickly. "I'll come by this weekend and take a look. Probably nothing important." He laughed softly, and I could hear the sound of clinking ice in a glass. It was noon. After the call, I sat by the window for a long time, staring at the sea that Robert had loved so much. The waves were restless, breaking against the rocks with a rhythm that felt almost deliberate. I thought of him sitting at this same window years ago, reading aloud from the Bible. Not because he was devout, but because he liked the cadence of the language. He used to say that words mattered more than belief, that meaning lived in tone, not doctrine. Whoever had altered his will understood neither. That evening, I opened his desk again and searched for anything that might explain what I had found. There were notebooks filled with gardening notes, letters from old colleagues, the warranty for a lawnmower long gone. In one folder, I found correspondence with Mr. Lake, the lawyer, discussing the estate plan. The handwriting was steady and untroubled. I closed the folder and sat in the quiet room until dusk settled like a film over the furniture. The silence of an empty house can feel heavier than noise. It presses on the ears, fills the lungs, demands that you notice every small creak and breath. When the first shadows reached the floorboards, I realized I had not eaten all day. I made soup from a can, the simplest thing, and carried the bowl back to the study. I placed it on the desk beside the Bible and spoke aloud, not to Robert exactly, but to the air that still remembered his voice. "Who did this to you, my love?" The answer, of course, was no one and everyone. People do not simply forge signatures, they rewrite memory. Somewhere between grief and greed lies that soft place where conscience sleeps. Mark had been kind during the illness, attentive even, but there had been moments, small, quick, that now returned with a chill. The way he always asked me to sign checks without reading them, the way he corrected nurses as if my word carried less weight. The last week before Robert died, he had stayed in the hospital room overnight while I was sent home to rest. When I returned in the morning, the papers on the bedside table were gone. I had not thought to ask where. I carried the soup back to the kitchen untouched. The sea outside had darkened to slate, the horizon fading into a single long breath of gray. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and fell silent. I felt the house tilt slightly, not physically, but in the way a place changes when you stop pretending it is safe. I knew then that this was not a misunderstanding. Someone had tampered with the last thing Robert ever wrote, and by doing so, had tried to erase me from his ending. I went to the bedroom and took out my old lesson planner, the one with yellowed pages and faint pencil marks from my teaching years. On the first blank page, I wrote the date, then a single line. Found second will in Robert's Bible. Final clause altered. Handwriting not his. Underneath, I added, "Call Mr. Lake again Monday." The act of writing steadied me. Words have always been my weapon and my refuge. I underlined the word altered twice and closed the book. When I finally went to bed, I left the lamp on, unable to face the darkness. The sea outside whispered in the rhythm of old prayers. I thought about Robert's last weeks, about how he had looked at me from the hospital bed, his eyes still clear despite the pain. "Everything's in order, Ellie," he'd said. "You won't have to worry about a thing." I had believed him. I still believed him, which meant someone else had made sure his order became my chaos. I lay awake until the first light touched the curtains. I did not cry. I had done enough of that in the months after he passed. What I felt now was sharper, cleaner. Not rage exactly, but a resolve forming quietly beneath the ribs. They had taken his words. I would take them back. As the kettle began its morning whistle, I knew that something irreversible had happened. A line had been crossed, not just in ink, but in faith. Whoever had written that false sentence believed I would accept it, that age softens the will and dulls the sense of justice. They mistook stillness for surrender. I may have been an old woman, but I had taught generations of children how to read between the lines, and now I would do the same with the fragments of my own life. When I looked at the sea again, the horizon seemed closer, almost reachable. The house was the same, yet different, as if the walls had learned to listen. I folded the forged will back into its envelope, sealed it with tape, and placed it in the drawer beside the real one. 2 versions of a man's love, one genuine, one counterfeit. The truth, I told myself, would not hide forever. It never does. That was the moment the grief stopped being grief. It became something harder, almost luminous. Betrayal, when it is clean and undeniable, can burn away fear. I realized that morning that I was no longer afraid of being alone. I was afraid of forgetting who Robert truly was, and I would not let that happen. 3 days passed before I heard anything back from the lawyer, and in those 3 days the world seemed to rearrange itself quietly around me. The air in the house changed, somehow denser, as if the rooms were keeping a secret. Every time the post arrived, I felt a tremor of expectation that turned into disappointment the moment I saw that none of the envelopes bore his letterhead. In the meantime, I went about my daily routines, watering the garden, folding the laundry, walking to the market for milk and bread, pretending to be the kind of widow people expect. Orderly, resigned, harmless. But inside me, a slow current began to stir, not anger yet, something more deliberate, a gathering awareness that I had been pushed out of my own life, one quiet signature at a time. On the 4th morning, I took my notebook and went to town. The streets of Ashbourne were small and uneven, lined with antique stores that never changed their window displays. I moved slowly past them, stopping now and then to look at my own reflection in the glass, the figure of an elderly woman with a canvas bag and a deliberate stride. No one would look at me twice, and that invisibility was beginning to feel like armor. At the post office, I mailed a letter to Mr. Lake's assistant, enclosing a photocopy of the forged page with a brief note. Please confirm whether this matches the version on file. I signed it without flourish, just my name, and the act of posting it felt like a declaration of existence. As I walked back, I noticed how the town itself seemed to hum with indifference. People rushed past me, younger, louder, the kind who talk into their phones as if the air were deaf. No one made eye contact. I used to dislike that kind of anonymity, but now it suited me. When the world refuses to see you, you can move through it unseen. That thought gave me a strange comfort. I stopped at the bakery for a loaf of bread and saw Mark's wife, Claire, across the counter. She was buying croissants. Her nails painted the same pale color as the marble in her kitchen. When she noticed me, she hesitated, then smiled too widely. "Eleanor, how lovely to see you," she said, the words trembling slightly under their politeness. I returned the smile and said I had been keeping busy. She asked, "Mark mentioned you found some papers, something from Robert." Her tone was light, but the question came too quickly. I nodded. "A copy of the will. I'm having it verified." The smile flickered, almost imperceptibly. "Oh, of course." He thought it was probably a draft. She reached for her bag, her bracelets clinking softly. "You know how Robert liked to revise things." "No," I said quietly. "He liked to finish them." She laughed, that brittle sound people make when they don't know how to respond, and left without another word. When I returned home, I noticed that the mailbox had been left slightly open. Inside were the usual circulars, a bank statement, and a letter from the insurance company, addressed not to me, but to estate of Robert Greene, executor, Mark Greene. It was dated 2 weeks ago. I slit it open carefully with a kitchen knife and read the first lines. Dear Mr. Greene, as per your request, the transfer of the remaining joint account balance will proceed once verification is complete. The amount listed was more than I remembered being there. It was possible Robert had moved funds before he died, but it was also possible that Mark had. I folded the letter back into its envelope and placed it in my notebook. One more piece of a puzzle I had not been invited to solve. That evening, while washing dishes, I caught sight of my reflection in the window and thought of how quickly age makes a person transparent. There was a time when my opinions mattered in this house, when decisions were discussed over dinner, when Robert would look at me for confirmation before signing anything. Somewhere along the way, I had become decorative, useful only in the gentle tasks of companionship. I had accepted it then because love makes such compromises seem like virtue. Now, seeing my face half lit by the kitchen lamp, I realized that invisibility had not been granted to me by time. It had been engineered. Every kindness, every gentle dismissal, every "don't worry about it, Mom," had been a rehearsal for this larger erasure. The next morning, I began to take notes on everything. Phone calls, dates, names, even the tone of voices. I made a copy of both wills and placed them in separate envelopes. I labeled one truth and the other story. That small act gave me more satisfaction than I would have expected. I called the bank to check on the joint account and was told politely that access was restricted until the executor confirmed the final transfer. When I asked who the executor was, the woman hesitated before replying, Mr. Mark Greene. I told her I had not appointed him executor. I'm sorry, Mrs. Greene, that's what we have on file, she said, and ended the call. The day stretched long and heavy. I spent the afternoon in the garden, trimming dead branches, trying to think clearly. The wind carried the smell of salt and rosemary, the same scent that had marked so many summers of our life here. I remembered Robert kneeling beside me in the soil, laughing about how the roses never obeyed pruning rules. They're like people, he used to say. Cut them too soon and they stop blooming. It struck me then how little of that man remained in the life he left behind. His garden, his words, even his handwriting, all rewritten by someone else's ambition. At dusk, I walked down to the edge of the cliff, the place where we used to watch the ships. The horizon was painted with a narrow band of gold that faded quickly into gray. I sat on the bench and took out the insurance letter, reading it again. The sea roared below, relentless, the sound of something ancient that refused to care about human frauds. I thought of calling Mark right then, confronting him, demanding an explanation. But confrontation is a luxury of those still naive enough to expect honesty in return. I needed proof, not confession. That night, I left the lights on in the study and spread both wills across the desk. The ink of the forged one gleamed slightly under the lamp, still too new, as if freshly dried. I leaned closer, studying every loop and curve, and noticed something I had missed before. A faint indentation on the page beneath the signature. The ghost of another line written before it was replaced. I held the paper to the light and tilted it until the letters became visible in relief. It read, "She shall receive all that remains." My breath caught. Someone had traced over his words, pressing harder to conceal them. But the original still lived underneath like a whisper refusing burial. I took a sheet of thin parchment from the drawer, placed it gently over the page, and shaded it with a pencil until the hidden words emerged in gray outline. It felt almost sacred, as if Robert himself were guiding my hand. When the sentence became clear, I sat back, trembling not from fear, but from vindication. He had not betrayed me. He had been betrayed with me. That realization changed everything. I stayed at the desk until midnight, writing in my notebook. Mark altered the will after death. Motive, financial control, possible assistance from lawyer's clerk or witness. I listed questions, then underlined one. Why hide it in the Bible? Perhaps Robert had suspected something. Perhaps he had wanted me to find it, to see what they would try to erase. The idea made my chest tighten. For the first time since his death, I spoke his name aloud without sadness, only resolve. I see it now, Robert. I understand. In the days that followed, I noticed small changes around town. People who used to wave now avoided my eyes. At the grocery store, the cashier asked too many questions about whether I lived alone. One afternoon, I saw a car I didn't recognize parked near the house, engine idling. A man inside pretending to check his phone. When I stepped outside, he drove away without looking back. Maybe it was nothing, maybe paranoia, but I had learned to trust unease. It's the body's way of remembering what the mind refuses to face. At night, I began locking the doors twice, checking the windows, hiding the original documents in the oven. No one ever looks there. I knew I must appear ridiculous, an old widow barricading herself against invisible enemies. But reason is a fragile thing when truth has been stolen. Each day I grew quieter, deliberate, more watchful. The document you enclosed does not match the current file. Please schedule a meeting to discuss discrepancies. My hands shook as I read it. I folded the letter carefully, placed it beside the forged will, and exhaled. There it was. The first crack in their version of events. The first confirmation that I was not mad. That night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea gone cold, listening to the sea and the wind moving through the grass. The house was silent, except for the clock. I thought about all the years I had spent teaching children how to find patterns, how to see what others missed. Reading, I used to tell them, is not about letters. It's about the spaces between them. Now at 81, I was reading the spaces of my own life, and what I saw there was both terrifying and clarifying. I placed my hand on it and whispered a promise I had not planned to make. I will find the truth, my love. I will not let them write the ending without me. The waves answered in their endless rhythm, and for the first time in months, I slept without dreams. I had barely slept, not from fear anymore, but from the restlessness that comes when you know you are standing on the edge of something you can no longer ignore. The letter from the law office lay on the kitchen table beside my teacup, the black print stark against the pale wood. Does not match the current file. The words pulsed faintly every time I looked at them. Proof, small but undeniable, that the world I had trusted was a fabrication built neatly around me. I put on my coat and gloves, the same ones Robert used to tease me about, and set out before the postman had even begun his route. The office of Lake and Partners occupied a converted townhouse near the square, its brass plate dulled by years of salt air. Inside, it smelled of paper, stale coffee, and the faint perfume of ambition. The receptionist, a pale girl with heavy eyeliner, looked up from her computer as I entered. When I gave my name, recognition flickered across her face, followed by discomfort. "Mr. Blake is in conference," she said quickly, "but I can let him know you're here." I nodded, removing my gloves with deliberate calm, and sat on the leather chair near the window. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. After a few minutes, she reappeared, voice softer now. "He'll see you." Mr. Lake looked older than I remembered, smaller too, as if the walls had pressed him inward. He gestured for me to sit. His smile practiced. "Eleanor," he began, "I understand there's been some confusion regarding a document." I placed the envelope containing both wills on the desk between us. "Confusion is not the word I would use," I said. "Deceit feels closer." He blinked, rearranging his expression into professional neutrality. "Perhaps you could explain what you believe has happened." I unfolded the pages carefully, smoothing them flat with my hand. "This is the version found in my husband's Bible. And this," I laid down the second, "is the one filed with your office. You'll notice the difference." He leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, scanning the lines. The silence stretched. Then he cleared his throat. "Mrs. Green, I can see there's an inconsistency, but it's possible your late husband made an amendment that wasn't processed through our office. Occasionally, clients—" "Robert was not a man who did anything occasionally," I interrupted, my voice quiet but unwavering. "He finalized his affairs with precision. This line," I pointed to the forged sentence, "is not his. The pen pressure is wrong, the ink is newer, and there's a faint impression of the original words underneath." I slid across the tracing I had made. For the first time, his eyes lifted from the page to meet mine, uncertain. "That's quite an observation," he said. "Years of grading essays," I replied. "You learn to see what's been erased." He exhaled slowly, folding his hands. "Mrs. Green, I have to be honest with you. Your stepson was involved in some of the estate administration during your husband's illness. He may have had access to certain documents. If what you're suggesting is true, it would be serious." "Fraudulent," I said. "The word you're looking for is fraudulent." He hesitated again. "I'll need to review the case file and speak with the witnesses. Could you leave these copies with me?" "Not the originals," I said. "You'll get duplicates." He nodded, conceding. When I rose to leave, he stood as well, his politeness slipping into something more human. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "you should be careful. When money and family mix, truth gets lost faster than you think." Outside, the fog had thickened, the streets muffled, every sound absorbed into damp air. I walked home slowly, feeling both lighter and more exposed. The certainty I had sought no longer felt like comfort. Knowing the truth meant I could no longer pretend ignorance was safety. As I reached the cottage, I saw the mailbox hanging open again. Inside was a single envelope, no return address, my name written in unfamiliar block letters. I opened it, standing in the doorway. "Please stop digging. Let things be as they are. This isn't good for anyone." The words were typed, unsigned. For a moment I could only stare at the page, the taste of metal filling my mouth. Then I folded it neatly and placed it beside the others. Threats are only frightening when you still believe you can be hurt in the old ways. I had already lost everything that could be taken. That night I sat by the fire, the Bible on my lap, and turned to the page where I had found the will. The paper still bore faint traces of erasure, the indentation of Robert's original words beneath the forgery. I ran my fingers across them, feeling the texture rather than reading the letters, and for the first time in months, I felt his presence, not as memory, but as a kind of insistence. He had hidden the will there for me to find, knowing perhaps that the people he trusted would not protect me. It was not just a document, it was a message. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine his voice, the slow, deliberate way he used to speak when something mattered. Don't let them decide who you were to me. That was what the erased line said, whether written or not. The following day, I called Mark and asked him to come over. He arrived in the afternoon, wearing a tailored coat and that expression of practiced concern that never quite reached his eyes. "I got your message, Mother," he said, stepping into the kitchen as if it still belonged to him. "What's all this about?" I gestured to the table where both wills lay side by side. "You tell me." His gaze flicked to the pages, then back to me. "You've been through a lot. Grief can make people imagine things." I smiled faintly. Grief doesn't change ink composition. He shifted his weight, defensive now. "You're accusing me of something serious." "I'm not accusing," I said. "I'm remembering." For a moment, we just looked at each other. I saw, beneath the practiced calm, the flicker of irritation that comes when control begins to slip. "Dad wanted things simple," he said finally. "He didn't want you to have to deal with the burden of the estate." "Burden," I repeated softly, testing the word like a bitter fruit. "That's what you call the life I built with him?" He sighed, feigning patience. "It's complicated, Mother." "You wouldn't understand the logistics." I leaned closer. "Try me." But he only shook his head, muttered something about having to leave, and was gone before I could stop him. Through the window, I watched him walk to his car, shoulders stiff, phone already in his hand. When he was gone, I laughed, a quiet, astonished sound that startled even me. For months, I had been mourning not only Robert, but the illusion of family, of belonging. Now, the farce was complete. They thought they could tidy me away, like an old photograph turned to the wall. Yet the more they tried to erase me, the clearer I became to myself. That night, I took out the tracing of Robert's original words and framed it in a small wooden frame from the attic. I placed it on the mantelpiece where our wedding photo once stood. It was not a shrine. It was a reminder that love, when honest, cannot be rewritten without leaving marks. Over the next few weeks, I began to act, quietly. I withdrew small amounts of cash from the account still in my name, enough to last if things turned unpleasant. I visited the local notary, an old student of mine named Sam Turner, who had once written an essay on ethics that made me cry. He listened as I explained everything, his expression grave. "I'll help you," he said. "We'll file a statement and get the original documents authenticated." I thanked him, and for the first time since Robert's death, I felt something close to safety. Not security, the kind built on money or promises, but the steadiness that comes when you remember you still have agency. At home, I noticed small details I had never truly seen before. The way the afternoon light hit the framed tracing, the faint smell of lavender in Robert's old coat, the rhythm of the sea like breath against the house. Grief had dulled all that. Truth sharpened it again. I began writing letters to myself in the evenings, reflections, fragments of memory, instructions for the days ahead. "You are not fading," I wrote one night. "You are developing like a photograph in slow solution." It made me smile. One morning, a week after my visit to Sam, I woke to find the fog lifted entirely. The sky was an impossible blue, the kind Robert used to call painter's light. I made coffee and stood at the window, the warmth of the cup seeping into my hands. The horizon looked endless. I realized that something inside me had shifted permanently. The fear that had followed me since finding the will had turned into something steadier, almost calm. I had been waiting for permission all my life to speak, to act, to exist without being defined by someone else's version of me. Now, without meaning to, I had given that permission to myself. The truth about the forgery would come out eventually. I could feel it. But even if it didn't, I had already reclaimed what mattered. The certainty that Robert had loved me without condition, that his final words were not a denial, but an affirmation that someone else had tried and failed to erase. I sat down at the desk and wrote in my notebook, "The tide is turning." Then, for the first time in many months, I went outside without my coat, letting the wind move through my hair, the sunlight warming my face. I felt alive, not as a widow defined by loss, but as a woman standing again in her own story. The first hint that the past was not content to remain buried came in the form of a knock that was far too polite to belong to anyone with good intentions. It was early evening, the sky bruised with the slow fading of light, and I had just finished writing in my notebook when the sound came again. 3 measured taps against the wood, not hurried, not hesitant, the rhythm of someone who expects to be received. When I opened the door, Mark was standing there, a shadow of composure wrapped in a coat too fine for this weather, his eyes hidden behind the polite concern he wore like armor. "Mother," he said, his voice soft but flat, "we need to talk." The way he said "need" unsettled me. He didn't mean conversation. He meant control. I stepped aside without inviting him, and he entered, glancing around the house as if assessing the worth of everything in sight. He began with pleasantries. How was I managing? Was I eating properly? Had I considered moving into assisted living? But his tone was mechanical, rehearsed. Then, as if remembering the true reason for his visit, he reached into his coat and placed a document on the table. "This," he said, "is an updated agreement. It's just a formality. The lawyer thought it would simplify the estate matters." I didn't touch the papers. "Simplify for whom?" I asked. His smile was practiced. "For everyone. You know." The first I asked, the mask slipped then, just briefly, a tightening of the jaw, a quick glance at the door as though calculating distance. "Mother," he said finally, his voice cooling. "You're not well. You've been under strain. I understand how grief can distort things." He spoke the words gently, as if to a child, but there was an edge beneath the calm. "You're implying," I said, "that I imagined a forged document." He didn't answer directly. "I'm implying that this whole matter could become very unpleasant if it continues. For you, for me, for Dad's memory." That last phrase landed like a blade wrapped in velvet. I told him to leave. He did, but not before saying something that chilled the air between us. "You're making enemies where you should have family." When the door closed, I realized my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the slow burn of recognition. I sat in the living room, the document still on the table, the silence pressing down like weight. The sea outside was restless, the waves pounding the rocks as if echoing the turmoil inside me. The next morning, I went to see Sam Turner, the notary. His small office smelled of ink and lemon polish. He looked up when I entered and seemed to understand without words. I handed him the new document. He scanned it, frowned, and muttered, "They're trying to get you to sign a transfer of title." He explained how the wording would effectively give Mark authority to sell the cottage under the guise of managing the estate. "Do not sign anything," he said, his voice firm. "They can't force you without consent, but they might try to create the illusion that you already agreed." His words confirmed what my instincts had already whispered. This was no misunderstanding. It was a campaign, carefully organized, counting on my silence. I left the office and walked to the pier, the wind sharp against my face. Fishermen were hauling in their nets, the ropes thick with seaweed and the smell of salt. Watching them work, methodical, relentless, reminded me that truth, too, must be hauled in from deep water. It doesn't rise willingly. It must be pulled, hand over hand, against resistance. I stood there for a long time, breathing the cold air, and made a decision. I would not confront Mark again. I would expose him. Back at home, I began gathering everything: letters, photocopies, even old bank statements showing dates that contradicted his claims. I wrote a detailed account of events from the day Robert died, cross-referencing each memory with something tangible. The process steadied me. I no longer felt like a frightened widow. I felt like a woman preparing a case, which in a sense I was. When the work was done, I sealed everything in a large envelope and placed it under the loose floorboard beneath my desk, the same spot where Robert used to hide Christmas gifts. The following days brought new forms of quiet pressure. Claire called, her voice syrupy with concern. She suggested I come stay with them for a while, just until everything is sorted out. When I declined, she sighed dramatically. "We're worried about you, Eleanor. You've been alone too long. It's not good for your mind." The phrase was deliberate. They were planting seeds of doubt, hoping to make any future claim of mine sound like the ramblings of senility. I responded politely, thanked her for the invitation, and hung up. Then I wrote another entry in my notebook. "They want me discredited before I can be heard." That evening, as I prepared dinner, I noticed that the porch light outside was flickering. When I went to check the bulb, I saw footprints in the damp soil near the back door, fresh, too large to be mine. They led toward the gate, then vanished. I locked every door and window, my pulse steady, but cold. Whoever had come had wanted me to know. Not to harm, not yet, but to warn. The message was clear. Stop, yield, fade. I made tea instead. If they wanted me afraid, they would have to work harder. The next morning, I returned to the law office. Mr. Lake was not there, but his assistant handed me a note with his handwriting. Review underway. Strong grounds for inquiry. Do not engage further with other parties. I slipped the paper into my pocket and thanked her. On the walk back, I realized how profoundly the rhythm of my life had changed. Each step felt deliberate, as if I were tracing the borders of a map that had always been there, but invisible until now. That afternoon, Mark arrived unannounced again. His manner had shifted from persuasion to pressure. He accused me of contacting the lawyer behind his back, said it would complicate matters, make me look unreasonable. I told him I had every right to verify the truth. He looked around the room, eyes resting on the framed tracing of Robert's erased line. "You really think he meant to give you everything?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp. "He pitied you, Mother. You were his responsibility. The cruelty of it was so casual, so practiced, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. Then I saw something flicker behind his expression. Not triumph, but fear. He knew I had the evidence. He left in anger, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass, and I stood there until the sound of his car faded. I realized I was no longer trembling. Anger, when it is pure, does not shake. It anchors. I spent the rest of the evening writing everything down, each word careful, factual, deliberate. I would not let emotion distort the record. When I finished, I read it aloud in the quiet house, the cadence of truth replacing the rhythm of grief. The following week, the inquiry began. Sam helped me file the official complaint, and soon letters arrived from the legal board requesting statements. Mark must have received notice because he called again, this time furious. "You've gone too far," he shouted. "You're destroying your own family." His voice cracked on the word family. I listened in silence until he ran out of breath. Then I said, "A family built on deceit is already destroyed." I hung up. Days passed, filled with a strange calm. Each morning, I walked along the beach, feeling the wind in my hair, the salt on my tongue. For the first time in months, I could think without fog. I began to realize that the battle I was fighting was not only for Robert's legacy, but for my own voice, long silenced by the polite tyranny of gratitude and duty. Every letter I wrote, every record I kept, was an act of reclamation. But peace is never left unchallenged. One night, I woke to the sound of breaking glass. I rushed to the living room and found the window shattered, a stone lying on the floor. Attached to it was a single sheet of paper. "End this before it ends you." The handwriting was unfamiliar, the kind people use when trying not to be recognized. I stood there barefoot on the cold floor, the wind whistling through the crack, and felt not fear but clarity. They had already ended the illusion of family. What more could they take? I swept up the glass, placed the note in a drawer, and went back to bed. The next morning, the sea was calm, unnervingly so. I brewed coffee and sat at the table with the Bible open in front of me. The page where Robert's words had been erased now looked almost translucent from my constant touch. I whispered them aloud. "She shall receive all that remains." And the sound filled the room like a benediction. In that moment, I understood that love, when it is true, does not end with death or betrayal. It waits to be defended. Later that day, I met Sam again. He told me the handwriting analysis had come back. The forged line was indeed written by a different hand. "They'll have to reopen the estate," he said. "Once it's official, everything changes." I thanked him, though the words felt too small. On my way home, I stopped by the florist and bought a single white rose. I placed it on the mantel beneath the framed tracing and whispered, "We're almost there, Robert." As night fell, the air filled with the scent of rain. I sat by the window, the rose glowing faintly in the lamplight, and listened to the storm gathering. Somewhere beyond the waves, the truth was rising to the surface, patient and unstoppable. I thought of all the years I had lived quietly, believing silence was virtue, believing endurance was strength. I understood now that silence can also be complicity, and endurance without protest is surrender. I had been quiet for too long. The thunder broke suddenly, and I felt something inside me respond, a shattering, but not of fear. I stood, went to my desk, and began to write again, not a statement or an account this time, but a letter to myself. You are the witness and the proof. They can take the house, the money, even the name, but they cannot rewrite your memory. When I finished, I folded the paper and slipped it inside the Bible beside Robert's note. The two truths resting together at last. The storm raged through the night, waves pounding the shore, wind tearing at the shutters, but inside the cottage there was stillness. I understood then that I had crossed a line from which I would not return, not because I sought revenge, but because I could no longer live in a world built on someone else's version of love. I had become, in a quiet and irrevocable way, free. The day of the hearing dawned gray and heavy, the kind of morning when the air itself feels reluctant to rise. I dressed slowly, aware of every movement, choosing the dark navy dress I had worn to Robert's funeral, pressing it carefully with the same deliberation one reserves for rituals that matter. It was not vanity, but a form of discipline, a way to tell myself that control, though fragile, was still mine. I tied my hair back, fastened the small pearl earrings he had given me on our 20th anniversary, and looked at my reflection in the mirror. The face staring back was lined, pale, but steady. There are moments in a life when you sense that time has folded, that everything before has been leading to a single corridor of truth. This was mine. Sam arrived at 8. He carried a briefcase and the same quiet compassion that had sustained me for weeks. "Are you ready?" he asked. "As much as one can be," I said. We drove to the courthouse in near silence, the only sound the soft hum of the tires on the wet road. Outside the windows, the town passed like a series of half-forgotten images, shops closed, people hurrying, the world indifferent to the private reckonings of the old. When we arrived, the building loomed above us, its columns streaked with rain, the flag limp in the wind. I felt suddenly small, not because I doubted myself, but because justice, in all its grandeur, often seems too vast for human hands. Inside, the courtroom was cool and bright, smelling faintly of polish and paper. Mark was already there, seated beside his lawyer, the same smooth-faced man who had once smiled at me across a conference table as if I were a benign inconvenience. Mark did not look at me when I entered. He was dressed impeccably, his hair slicked back, his posture unbent, the picture of filial composure. Only his jaw betrayed him, tense, locked, a pulse flickering beneath the skin. I took my seat beside Sam and folded my hands on the table. Across the aisle, the forged will lay on display, its ink stark against the white paper, the silent witness to everything that had followed. The proceedings began with formalities, names, dates, procedural clarifications. The judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and an even sharper tone, listened without expression. When Sam rose to speak, his voice was calm, precise, deliberate. He presented the evidence piece by piece, the handwriting analysis, the chemical aging of the ink, the correspondence with the law office, the original drafts Robert had signed. Each document was like a step in a staircase built toward revelation. When he finished, the room felt altered, as if the air itself had thickened with consequence. Then it was Mark's turn. His lawyer spoke first, weaving a story of confusion, of innocent mistakes and misplaced trust. A narrative designed to blur responsibility until no one could see its outline. I listened, detached, the way one listens to the drone of bees through glass. When he finished, the judge looked at Mark and asked if he wished to add anything. He stood, smoothed his jacket, and turned toward me for the first time. "My father loved my stepmother," he began, his tone soft, rehearsed. "But in his last years he was concerned about her ability to manage alone. He asked me to ensure things were handled responsibly. Any inconsistencies in the documents were clerical." There was no intent to deceive. His voice faltered just slightly at the end, the single human tremor in a speech otherwise built on performance. The judge nodded, unimpressed. "Mrs. Green," she said, "you've requested to address the court directly. Do you still wish to do so?" Sam looked at me, questioning. I rose slowly. My knees ached, but my voice did not. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. I stepped forward, my hands clasped before me, and for a moment the room fell utterly silent. I could hear the rain against the windows, the faint hum of the overhead lights. "I'm not here for money," I began. "I've lived long enough to know that wealth disappears faster than grief. What doesn't disappear, what endures, is truth. My husband wrote a will, and in that will he left his words to stand as his final act of love. Those words were altered after his death. Someone thought they could replace affection with convenience, loyalty with control. They were wrong. Love does not end in ink, but ink can betray it." I paused, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. The sentence they erased said that I was to receive all that remained, because I had given him everything he had. That was not vanity. It was his acknowledgement of a life shared, of years built together. To remove those words was not just to steal property, it was to rewrite memory, to falsify a man's last kindness. I am old, yes, but my sight is clear. I know my husband's hand, and I know his heart. The line they forged does not belong to either. When I finished, there was no sound except the turning of the judge's pages. She looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then nodded for me to sit. I returned to my chair, the silence dense, expectant. Mark stared at the table, his fingers rigid. The judge spoke quietly, but firmly. "The court finds substantial evidence of document tampering. The contested clause is invalid. The original will stand." The gavel struck once, sharp and final, and the sound rang through the room like a release. For a moment, I could not move. It was not triumph I felt, nor even relief, but something slower, deeper, a settling of balance long disturbed. Mark rose abruptly, muttered something to his lawyer, and left the room without looking back. I watched him go, not with bitterness, but with the weary understanding that some losses arrive long before they are acknowledged. Sam placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. "No," I replied. "It's only begun." Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening like mirrors. I walked without hurry, my umbrella closed at my side. The air smelled of wet stone and distant sea. Each step felt lighter, as though the ground had been returned to me. At the courthouse steps, I paused, looked up at the thinning clouds, and let the cool air fill my lungs. For months I had lived in a house shadowed by deceit, convinced that I was losing my place in the story of my own life. Now, standing there, I understood that I had reclaimed not only my home, but the narrative itself. When I returned to the cottage, the rooms greeted me with silence. But it was a different kind of silence, no longer oppressive, but open, like the pause after music when the last note still vibrates in the air. I lit a candle on the mantel beside the framed tracing of Robert's erased words and placed beside it the court's written verdict, folded neatly. The two documents side by side seemed to speak to each other, one forged and false, one honest and final. That evening, I made tea, the same way I had on the morning I first found the will, and sat by the window, watching the horizon fade into twilight. The sea was calm again, the tide low, the rocks glistening like fragments of memory. I thought of Robert, his quiet laughter, his steady hands, the way he always paused before signing anything, as if aware that every signature was a promise. They had tried to steal his last promise from me, and I had taken it back. I stayed there until darkness settled fully, the candle burning low, the tea gone cold. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang the hour. I closed my eyes and listened, not to the sound itself, but to the space between the tolls, the silence that held it together. It reminded me of the way we had lived, our love not loud or dramatic, but constant, sustained by the quiet faith that we would endure whatever came. And we had, in our way. Even in his absence, Robert had kept his word. Before going to bed, I opened the Bible one last time to the page that had begun it all. The faint outline of his erased sentence was still visible, stubborn as ever, refusing to fade. I placed my hand over it and whispered, "It's done, my love. You are safe now." The wind rustled the curtains gently, almost like a reply. I closed the book, turned off the lamp, and stood for a moment in the dim light of the moon before drawing the curtains shut. In the end, justice had not restored what was lost. It had revealed what had always been mine. And that, I realized, was enough. The months that followed unfolded with a quietness so complete it felt almost like an afterlife, the kind one enters while still breathing. The legal letters stopped coming, the phone calls dwindled, and the neighbors, who had once whispered and speculated, began again to greet me with cautious warmth. The air in the house grew lighter, as if the walls themselves had exhaled after holding their breath too long. Yet peace, I discovered, is not the absence of noise, but the understanding of it. Every silence carries the echo of what came before. I still found myself waking in the early hours, my body trained by habit to listen for disturbances that no longer arrived. But instead of fear, there was only awareness, the steady pulse of my own life returning to its rhythm. I began to walk to the library every morning, the long path that followed the cliff and curved toward the town. The sea accompanied me, shifting colors with the hour, silver at dawn, blue by noon, black and full of stars at dusk. The rhythm of those walks became a kind of devotion. I had promised myself that I would not let the story of what happened harden into bitterness. The world expects bitterness from widows, as if grief must ferment into resentment to be legitimate. I refused that inheritance. Instead, I sought something slower, something resembling grace. The library was small and smelled of paper and dust, the kind of scent that carries memory. I spoke with the director, a young woman with restless eyes, and asked if she might allow me to start a reading circle for women who, like me, had been told for most of their lives that their voices were better kept soft. She agreed immediately, and within a month the circle began. We met on Wednesday evenings in the back room, a dozen women of different ages, all carrying the invisible weight of what they could not say elsewhere. We read aloud not just books, but letters, diaries, fragments of thought. I told them that reading is an act of reclamation, that every sentence written in truth pulls a thread of dignity back from oblivion. They listened, some nodding, some weeping quietly, and in their faces I recognized parts of myself, younger, wounded, and still searching. At home, I kept Robert's Bible on the mantel, no longer as evidence but as remembrance. The forged page had been sealed in the court's archive, but I had kept the tracing, now faded slightly at the edges. I placed it inside the cover, along with a note of my own. If ever these words are found again, let whoever reads them know that love outlasted deceit. It was not addressed to anyone in particular. It was enough that it existed. Some evenings, I imagined that a generation after me, a granddaughter perhaps, or the child of one of those women from the reading circle, might open it and understand that history is made not only of victories, but of the quiet endurance that keeps truth alive after the noise fades. Mark never came back. Through Sam, I learned he had moved to another city, started a business that quickly failed, and remarried. I did not hate him. Hatred is too expensive. It spends the soul faster than grief. What remained instead was a detached sorrow, the kind one feels when realizing that some people choose the small safety of lies over the vastness of love. He had lost something far greater than money. He had lost the chance to be decent when decency was still possible. I hoped in some quiet place within him that he knew it. The cottage itself began to change. I painted the kitchen a pale yellow, replaced the heavy curtains with linen ones that caught the morning light, and opened the windows whenever the weather allowed. The sound of the sea entered freely now, no longer as an intruder, but as a companion. I planted herbs by the back door, rosemary, thyme, and lavender, and found comfort in their stubbornness. Life, I realized, does not apologize for continuing. It simply does. The trick is to move with it, not in defiance, but in acknowledgement. On the first anniversary of Robert's death, I walked to the edge of the cliff where we used to sit together and watch the ships disappear beyond the horizon. The air smelled of salt and wild fennel. I carried with me a single white rose and the court's verdict folded in my pocket, not as a symbol of victory, but as a reminder that truth, once spoken, does not need to shout. I placed the rose on the bench, looked out at the endless water, and whispered, "It's all right now." The wind lifted the words and carried them somewhere I could not see. That night, as I sat by the fire, I wrote one final entry in my notebook. What they tried to erase became the map of my return. The line they forged taught me to write my own. It felt like a closing, not of life, but of a long and unfinished chapter. I closed the book, set it beside the Bible, and turned off the lamp. The cottage glowed softly in the moonlight, each object in its rightful place, as if the world had been rearranged with care. In the months that followed, women from the reading circle began leaving their own letters in a small wooden box we kept at the library. Some were stories of forgiveness, others of quiet rebellion, all written in the same steady belief that words matter. We called it the Box of Kept Voices. Each week we read one aloud and then placed it back, not to be archived, but to be remembered. When I heard them read, I thought of Robert again, his insistence that language could hold truth even when people failed. He had been right. Now, when I wake before dawn, I no longer listen for danger. I listen for the first sound of the sea, for the faint rustle of wind through the rosemary outside my window, for the heartbeat of a house that has learned to breathe again. Sometimes I think I hear his footsteps in the hallway, but I know it's only the boards settling. Still, I smile. In some secret way, the life we built continues, not untouched, but unbroken. The last thing he wrote was meant to be love, and that is exactly what it became.